"You're not worthy of my handshake, Mr. President." With those words, Dolph Lundgren did what no one else dared. He stopped Donald Trump cold in front of thousands, and the moment that followed shook America to its core. Make sure to like, drop a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned, because what comes next will leave you speechless. The morning had broken clear and cool in Washington. The kind of morning that carried a weight with it, the kind that reminded people they were standing in the presence of something greater than themselves. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the air seemed almost hushed, as though the granite wall itself demanded silence. Families gathered close together, hands clutching faded photographs and folded flags. Veterans, some bent with age, some still walking tall in their service jackets, moved with the solemn grace of men who carried memories that never really faded. The whole place felt like a sanctuary without walls, an open cathedral of sacrifice, where the names etched in black stone reached into the hearts of everyone present. Dolph Lundgren walked slowly toward the wall, dressed not in a suit or starched uniform borrowed for the day, but in his own well-worn service fatigues, pressed and clean, but marked with the passage of time. The fabric looked almost soft from years of careful keeping, and on his chest sat the modest insignia of a man who had served his country without expectation of glory. He walked without fanfare, without entourage, but the moment he stepped onto the pathway that curved along the black granite, people noticed. It wasn't his fame from movies or the legend that younger crowds whispered about him on the internet. It was the way he carried himself, quiet, steady, with the look of a man who had lived both the fight and the faith that came with being a soldier. Several veterans recognized him at once. A gray-haired Marine in a wheelchair reached out a trembling hand as Lundgren passed. "You've always stood with us," the man whispered, his voice thick. Dolph stopped, knelt down to eye level, and clasped the Marine's hand between both of his grip firm but gentle. "I was one of you," Dolph said softly, so only the man and those closest could hear. "I'll always be one of you." Tears welled in the old Marine's eyes, and a few others standing nearby bowed their heads, overcome by the sincerity in those simple words. Lundgren moved closer to the wall, his eyes roaming over the endless list of names. He lowered his head, closed his eyes for a moment, and stood in complete silence. For a few long breaths, it felt as though the entire memorial held still, waiting with him, sharing the weight he bore. Some veterans whispered prayers. Others wiped their eyes quietly. Families of the fallen looked on with gratitude, seeing in him not just a celebrity, but a brother in arms who had never forgotten what this place meant. It was then that the whispers began to ripple through the crowd. A young reporter near the outer edge of the memorial pressed a finger to his earpiece and murmured into his microphone, "The president is on his way. Repeat. President Trump will be arriving at the memorial shortly." Heads turned. The quiet reverence of the gathering shifted, the calm air thickening with unease. Many veterans stiffened, faces tightening with something close to resentment. They knew the president had not been scheduled. No one had expected him. This day, they thought, belonged to the names on the wall and the families who had carried the weight of those names for decades. The idea that it might now become a stage for politics angered them deeply. A man in a worn army jacket muttered under his breath, but loud enough that those nearby caught every word. "He's not here for them. He's here for the damn cameras. Always has to make it about himself." The veteran next to him, a tall man with a cane, nodded sharply, his jaw set. This was supposed to be about the brothers we lost, about the names on that wall, not some circus act for headlines. A woman clutching a folded flag to her chest turned her face away, her voice trembling with anger. "My husband's name is on that wall, and he thinks he can just barge in here for a photo op. Shameful." The bitterness spread through the crowd like a ripple, growing louder with each muttered word. Shoulders tightened, eyes hardened. What had been a sacred silence was now charged with resentment, a wall of quiet fury, waiting to see how the moment would play out. Cameras began clicking as the presidential motorcade pulled up on the edge of the mall. The noise of helicopters overhead, breaking the fragile quiet that had settled around the wall. Reporters surged forward, the scrape of their shoes against the pathway echoing unnaturally loud. Security agents moved quickly, their radios crackling, their presence a stark intrusion into what had moments ago been sacred silence. Dolph Lundgren turned slightly, watching the commotion build. His expression stayed calm, but inside he felt a tightening in his chest. He had known this could happen. The first glimpse of Trump came as he stepped from the armored car, waving broadly to the cameras that flashed and flickered like 1,000 fireflies gone wild. His trademark confidence radiated in every step, his long coat brushing against him as he strode toward the memorial. Reporters shouted questions. Security guards cleared a path, and the murmurs of discontent from the veterans grew louder, carried like a low tide through the gathered crowd. Dolph could feel the veterans' anger. He turned back to the wall for a brief moment, placing a calloused hand gently against the cool black granite, as if drawing strength from the thousands of names beneath his fingertips. He whispered, "This is for you, not for anyone's glory." Then the sound came. Reporters shoved their way to the front, elbows sharp, voices raised, jostling for the best shot. The air, once filled with quiet reverence, now crackled with the clamor of shouted questions and the clatter of camera shutters. A veteran in a faded navy cap stumbled as a cameraman barreled past, his balance lost. The old man went down hard on the walkway, the sound of his body striking the ground cutting through the din. Before anyone else could move, Dolph was there kneeling fast, his hands strong and steady as he lifted the veteran back to his feet. "You all right, brother?" Dolph asked, his eyes meeting the man's. The veteran winced, clutching his arm, but nodded. "I will be, thanks to you, but damn, they don't care who they trample, do they?" His voice was bitter, anger flashing in his eyes. Dolph gave his shoulder a firm squeeze before turning. That was when he saw Trump striding toward him. The president moved like he owned the ground he walked on, coat flaring slightly with each step. His smile was broad, practiced, almost mechanical, the kind of grin that never quite touched the eyes. Reporters crowded close behind him, lights flashing so bright they made the polished marble of the wall shimmer. Security agents cut a hard path, their faces tense, scanning the crowd like predators ready to strike. Veterans muttered curses under their breath. A few raised their voices now, not bothering to hide their contempt. "He's turning this into a damn circus," one barked, loud enough to draw nods from the men beside him. Another spat the words, "A photo op." "That's all this is, a show." The bitterness carried through the crowd, the low growl of men who'd sacrificed too much to stomach a spectacle at the place where their brothers' names were carved in stone. Trump didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. He kept that smile plastered on, waving briefly at the cameras before locking eyes with Lundgren. His voice boomed across the memorial as he closed the last few feet between them. "Dolph Lundgren, a true American hero. What an honor to see you here today." With that, he thrust out his hand, arms stiff, his grin wider than ever, the cameras flashing like a storm around him. Dolph stood still, shoulders squared, his expression calm, but immovable. He didn't reach for the hand. He kept his own arm at his side, his eyes steady on the president. The moment stretched thick and heavy. For 3 long, painful seconds, Trump's hand hovered in the air, unanswered. The sound of cameras firing filled the silence, a staccato rhythm that only made the tension worse. The crowd began to buzz, whispers rising fast. "He's not taking it. Did you see that? He won't shake his hand. Lord Almighty, this is going to blow up everywhere." The veterans' mutters turned into open voices, some with anger, some with awe. A few clapped quietly under their breath, pride flashing in their tired eyes. Families pulled closer together, sensing the weight of the moment. Trump's smile wavered just slightly, the edges stiffening as his hand dropped slowly back to his side. For the briefest second, confusion flickered in his eyes, quickly masked under the same bright grin he'd walked in with. Around him, aides leaned toward each other, their whispers sharp and hurried. Secret Service agents stiffened, eyes darting across the crowd, their hands brushing the outlines of weapons beneath their coats. The tension in their posture spoke louder than words. Anything could happen now, and they knew it. Another hissed back, "Keep him moving. Don't let the press run with this." But Dolph didn't move, and neither did Trump. The two men stood facing each other, one smiling like it was all under control, the other holding steady with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. Finally, Dolph spoke, his voice low, carrying just enough to cut through the buzzing whispers. "You're not worthy of my handshake, Mr. President." He tipped his head ever so slightly toward the wall of names behind him. The words hit the air like a hammer striking steel. Reporters froze mid-question. The crowd quieted as though every ear had strained to catch the meaning. Veterans exchanged glances, their anger now mixed with something else, a recognition that Lundgren had spoken the truth they all carried. Trump kept his smile, though the muscles at the corner of his jaw tightened. He gave a quick nod like he'd heard the words, but wasn't about to let them land too deep. Cameras snapped furiously, catching every flicker of expression, every subtle shift in body language. Dolph didn't flinch under the lights or the noise. He let the silence sit for a moment longer. Then he stepped forward, his boots pressed firm against the pavement, and his eyes never left Trump's. With a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted one hand and pointed toward a small wooden table set a few yards away near the base of the granite wall. On the table rested a plain basin of water, a stack of white towels folded neatly beside it. The reporters leaned forward, confused, their pens scratching furiously. Some of the veterans furrowed their brows, unsure of what Dolph meant to do. But Dolph's voice, calm and steady, carried across the memorial. "In the service," he said, his tone even and low, "we learned that true leadership isn't about medals or rank or the sound of your name over a loudspeaker. It's about being willing to serve the man next to you, even if no one's watching. Before we speak as leaders today, I'm asking you to join me in remembering these men the right way, with a simple act that shows what leadership really means." He gestured again toward the basin. The crowd stirred, a wave of surprise moving through them. The press scribbled, some reporters whispering to their colleagues. One voice carried from the cluster of American officials nearby, sharp and urgent. "This isn't protocol," the aide hissed. "This isn't how a sitting president greets the public." Another official leaned close to Trump, speaking through clenched teeth. "Sir, we strongly advise against this. It's—" Trump raised a hand to cut him off, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. He saw the veterans standing there, arms crossed, jaws set, watching him with something closer to judgment than respect. He caught sight of families clutching folded flags, their faces drawn tight with suspicion, as though daring him to prove he belonged here. The grin on his face shifted, losing its polish just a touch. For the first time that day, a trace of something else, uncertainty, maybe humility, flickered in his eyes. He gave a sharp wave of his hand to silence his staff. Then, with a voice lower than the booming tone he had used before, he said, "All right, I'll do it." The crowd reacted instantly, a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward to see what would happen next. Dolph allowed the faintest of smiles, not one for the cameras, but a private acknowledgement that the moment had shifted. Slowly, he rolled up the sleeves of his old fatigues. The scars on his forearms showed pale against the tanned skin, a silent reminder that he had carried his share of battles long ago. He walked to the table, his movements unhurried, the way a man moves when he knows he's not performing, but teaching. He dipped his hands into the basin, the water cool against his skin, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the symbolism sink in for everyone watching. "This," Dolph said, raising his eyes toward Trump, "isn't about ceremony. It's about humility. It's about remembering that no matter what title we hold, we're here to serve these men." He nodded toward the wall behind him. They didn't fight for applause or photographs. They fought because they believed in something bigger than themselves. If we forget that, then all of this, he tapped the basin lightly, is meaningless. Trump's team looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting on their feet, exchanging nervous glances. A few security men scanned the crowd more urgently, as though this strange turn of events had thrown them off balance. Trump hesitated a moment longer, eyes flicking toward the cameras, then back to Dolph. The weight of the veteran's stares pressed heavy on him. Slowly, with a measured breath, he stepped toward the table. The crowd hushed. Even the reporters fell silent, their pens still mid-scratch. All you could hear was the faint hum of the city beyond the memorial, and the soft splash of water as Dolph's hands moved in the basin. Trump came to stand beside him. He looked down at the basin, then at Dolph. His grin was gone now, replaced by something tighter, quieter. "You're serious about this?" he muttered, his voice just above a whisper. Dolph met his eyes and answered plainly, "Dead serious." For a moment, neither man moved. Then Trump reached forward, his large hands brushing the surface of the water. He let the coolness wash over his fingers, his jaw still set. Dolph took a towel from the stack, handing it over. Trump accepted it, drying Dolph's hands with care that seemed almost awkward at first, as though he didn't quite know how to perform such a humble act. But as the crowd watched in utter silence, he grew more deliberate, the movement slower, steadier. When it was done, Dolph reached for another towel and repeated the act for Trump, drying his hands with the same respect he had been shown. The press scrambled to capture the moment, camera shutters clattering in a frenzy. Yet no one dared break the silence with their voices. Veterans stood straighter, some blinking back tears, others nodding in approval. Families held their flags closer, sensing that this act was not about politics, but about something older, deeper, and truer. Dolph set the towel down, looking again at the wall. "This is what leadership is meant to be," he said softly. "Serving, not being served." The crowd breathed again, a collective exhale, as if they'd all been holding it for those long, charged minutes. Trump glanced around, aware that the entire world would soon be replaying this moment. He gave a small nod, more genuine this time. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see where this goes." Dolph didn't answer. He simply placed both hands on the edge of the table, staring once more at the names carved into the granite as though drawing strength from them all over again. When the doors closed and the noise of the press finally faded down the long walkway, it felt like the memorial could breathe again. The crowd outside had settled into a heavy silence, though here and there you could still hear murmurs, the shifting of feet, and the faint clicking of cameras far beyond the barricade. The air smelled faintly of grass warmed by the afternoon sun, and the names carved into the black granite wall glowed under the light like they were watching. Dolph sat down slowly on the worn wooden bench near the wall. He lowered himself carefully, his old service boots planted firmly on the stone walkway, his eyes fixed on the endless rows of names stretching out behind him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just stared, letting the silence do what words never could. Trump lowered himself onto the bench beside him. The man who had swept into the memorial with booming confidence, lights flashing all around him, now seemed smaller, the weight of the silence pressing down on his shoulders. For the first time that day, his grin faded. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. Finally, Trump cleared his throat. "I didn't expect that," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been all day. "That handshake. You really caught me off guard." Dolph didn't turn to look at him. He kept his eyes on the wall. "That wasn't about you," he said evenly. "That was about them." He lifted his hand slightly, gesturing toward the granite. "Every one of those names means a man or woman who gave more than we ever will. If we turn their sacrifice into a photo op, we dishonor it." Trump shifted, his jaw working. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "I hear you. I really do. And I'll be honest with you, Dolph. I wanted the cameras. I wanted the pictures, the headlines. That's the truth." Dolph finally turned, his brows raised. He studied Trump's face for a moment, surprised by the blunt admission. "So, you're admitting you came here for publicity?" Trump met his eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching like he couldn't decide whether to smile or not. "I don't dance around things. You know that." "Yeah, I wanted the moment. I figured it would look good." Dolph leaned back, folding his arms, his expression hardening. "Then you shouldn't be here, because these names aren't props for your image. They're not a backdrop for anyone's campaign. These people died, Mr. President. They left mothers who cried themselves to sleep for the rest of their lives. They left kids who grew up without fathers, brothers who never came home. You don't get to use that pain to polish your reputation." Trump didn't flinch at the words, but his eyes flicked back to the wall. He stared at the rows of names, lips pressed together as though weighing something. "You're right," he said after a long silence. "But it's more than that. I wanted to be here because I've never worn the uniform. First president in a long time who's never served. I hear it every day. Reminders, criticisms. And it's true. I didn't serve. But I wanted to stand here anyway because the military, this wall, it's the foundation of the country I lead. And I want to be tied to that. I want people to know I care." Dolph studied him. The words weren't polished like a speech. They came out halting, uneven, maybe too plain to be rehearsed, but that didn't excuse the chaos of the morning. "You say you care," Dolph said slowly. "But what you brought with you today was noise. You came with sirens, cameras, reporters shoving old soldiers to the ground just to get their shot. Did you see that man in the Navy cap? He hit the ground because your people were more interested in a headline than his safety." Trump's eyes shifted, guilt flickering for a second. "I saw you help him." "I shouldn't have had to," Dolph said firmly. "He came here today to honor his brothers. Instead, he ended up trampled by a circus. That's on you." Trump opened his mouth, then closed it again, staring at the ground. The silence stretched. Dolph's voice softened, but the edge stayed. "Do you have any idea what these families live with? I've sat in living rooms where the walls were lined with pictures of young men in uniform, pictures that hadn't aged because the men in them never came home. I've seen mothers who still cry at the sound of a folded flag being handed to another widow. I've seen veterans who wake up screaming 40 years after the war because the battles don't leave when you come home. That's what you walked into today. That's what you turned into a stage." Trump's face tightened. For once, he didn't have a quick reply. He swallowed, his hands clasping together loosely. Finally, he said, "Maybe I screwed this up. Maybe I didn't think about it the way I should have." Dolph leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You did screw it up, but it's not too late to understand why. You want to show people you care about the military. Start by respecting their silence, their pain. Stop turning sacred ground into a backdrop. Trump's voice dropped lower. You're the first person to say that to me straight. Dolph gave a short nod. Maybe because you needed to hear it. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air was heavy, filled only with the distant rustle of flags and the faint sound of footsteps beyond the barricade. Then Trump looked at the wall again. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the booming tone he'd worn like armor all day. I may not know what it's like to lose a brother in combat, he said, but I know what it's like to be responsible for the men and women who might be sent into it. And I'll tell you, it keeps me up at night more than people realize. Maybe that's why I wanted to be here, to stand with them, even if I don't deserve it. Dolph studied him carefully, weighing the words. Then stand with them, he said. Not in front of them. There's a difference. Trump nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the granite wall. Neither man noticed the small microphone sitting on a nearby podium, still lit with a faint green glow. Every word of their exchange carried beyond the doors into the waiting ears of reporters who had expected a scandal and instead found themselves scribbling furiously about a conversation that was becoming something else entirely. You know, folks, as we wrap up this story, I just want to take a moment to share what it really left me thinking about. What we saw here wasn't about politics, wasn't about who had the bigger title, or even about the cameras that tried to steal the moment. It was about service. It was about sacrifice. And most of all, it was about humility. The kind that doesn't need to shout, the kind that speaks louder through action than any speech ever could. Dolph Lundgren showed us that leadership isn't about grabbing the spotlight. It's about stepping back and honoring those who gave everything. And even though President Trump walked in ready for the headlines, in the end, he walked away having learned something deeper. Something we all needed to be reminded of. That the names on that wall, the lives behind them, are not props. They are the very foundation of the freedom we enjoy every single day. For me, that's the real power of this story. It's a call to every one of us to remember that true strength comes from humility, from respect, from serving others before ourselves. And honestly, isn't that what our country needs more of right now? So let me ask you, what did this story make you feel? Did it change how you think about leadership, about sacrifice, about what really matters? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective because this isn't just a story for me to tell. It's a lesson for all of us to carry. Thanks for being here, my friends. Until next time, take care of one another.